Ladies and gentlemen, we bring a bit of history to you with our next session. Here to talk about the great Mughals are Audrey Truschke, Ira Mukhoty, and Simar Puneet. Please welcome them with a big round of applause. Ms. Truschke is Assistant Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University, and her research focuses on the cultural, imperial, and intellectual history of medieval and early modern India. Her first book, Culture of Encounters, looked at the literary, social, and political roles of Sanskrit during the Mughal era. Her second book, Aurangzeb, The Man and the Myth, is a historical reassessment of one of the most hated kings in South Asian history. Our next panelist, Ms. Mukhoty, is the author of Heroines, Powerful Indian Women of Myth and History, and Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens, and Begums of the Mughal Empire. She has 2 degrees in natural sciences and has studied in Delhi and Cambridge. She is working on her third project, a biography of Akbar the Great. Moderating this session is Ms. Puneet, Executive Editor at Aleph Book Company. She has worked with several notable authors, including Shashi Tharoor, Devdutt Patnaik, and Amitav Kumar. In 2018, she was the runner-up to the Editor of the Year award given by Publishing Next. Ma'am, I request you to please take this conversation forward.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session on the great Mughals with Professor Truschke and Ira Mukhoty. There has been an undeniable rise in interest in the Mughal period, thanks in no small part to the Hindu right wing and its project to rewrite and distort history. Although the Mughals were the most powerful and richest dynasty of their time, the pages of Indian history are filled with empires. So I want to begin by asking you, Professor Truschke, why do you think the Mughals continue to hold sway over the public imagination?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Why do the Mughals captivate us so? I think partly because they were sort of the biggest, the best, the brightest show in town in pre-modern and early modern India. No one ever had an empire as big as the Mughals did in pre-modern India. It's also, I think, perhaps partly because the Mughals directly precede the colonial era, right? The Mughal Empire technically overlaps with the first 100 years of colonial rule through the East India Company. And so perhaps for that reason, they continue to fascinate us. And, I think that interest should not come at the expense of other Indian empires and dynasties, right? India has a long, glorious history with much to interest us. But I do think that there's a little something there about the Mughals that justifiably captivates our imaginations.
The Mughals were very keen to be seen as Indian rulers, and they were Indian to the core, which is another aspect that the right wing seeks to cover up. They would like us to see them as foreigners. In this regard, I want you, Ira, to talk about the founder of the Mughal dynasty, Babur.
Right, so Babur began his life in Fergana, and he was the Prince of Fergana. His father died at the age of 12. And as Audrey told us yesterday, they had the Timurids, because the Mughals actually traced their lineage down to Timur. And in their system, there was no system of primogeniture. So the first prince, the eldest prince, did not become the ruler at all automatically. It was whoever was the most capable prince. So when Babur became the Prince of Fergana at the age of 12, he knew that his life was in danger because all his uncles and cousins wanted to be king too. And so the people that he turned to at this crucial and vulnerable time were actually his mother and his grandmother, Ehsan Daulat Begum and Kutluk Digar Khanum. And in his biography, he writes about how indispensable, invaluable their support and advice was as a young 12-year-old Mirza. Now, through his very difficult first few years when he's trying to found an empire, and he finds to his horror that this is the time of the Uzbeks, and Shaybani Khan Uzbek is his fiercest enemy. He keeps drifting away further and further from the region that he wants to rule, Herat and Samarkand. And finally, he is besieged one day by Shaybani Khan Uzbek in Samarkand. And for 6 months, the Timurids are reduced to eating dogs and donkeys, and they're being besieged, and there's no way out for them. And it's at this stage that Babur relinquishes, in a way, his sister, his eldest sister, Khanzada Begum. And because Shaybani Khan Uzbek tells him, he tells Babur, I will let you go with your few followers if you give me your eldest sister. So at this time, Babur has to make this difficult decision of leaving his sister back with Shaybani Khan Uzbek. He's given his freedom, he goes away. But he finds nothing which satisfies his enormous ambition in this region. He is being harried and harassed everywhere. Finally, one day, he looks towards Hindustan. And he decides that because way back in the time of Timur had made an invasion into Delhi. So he sends, very politely, he sends a goshawk, a hawk, to Ibrahim Sultan, saying that actually Delhi is mine, why don't you return it to me? But Ibrahim Sultan is very unimpressed by this kind of negotiation, and he says, bring it on. And Babur does, and at the Battle of Panipat, he wins Delhi, and he founds his empire. And the very first thing he does is he calls all the women folk, he calls all the Timurids, and he tells them all to come to India because he has finally found a place of safety. So for Babur, I do not ever see him as an invader, as a marauder, never. His idea was to found an empire worthy of his very grand ambitions as a descendant of Timur, to found an empire not just of geography, but of beauty, of architecture, of paintings, of poetry, because this is what the Timurids were, and we forget because the British called them Mongols and it became Mughals. Because the British had this habit of clumping together anybody who was Islamic in any way. But they were Timurids, and they had a very, in fact, if I can show you one slide, number 2, please, if you could show slide number 2. Yeah, okay, so this is a slide showing the court of Timur in 1404. So there was a Spanish ambassador who came to the court of Timur in 1404, and he wrote back in his letters about what he found. And if we read his descriptions, firstly we see the tents, which we are very familiar with in India, because the Mughals brought these tents with him throughout their reign. All the great Mughals always traveled everywhere in these extravagant cities of tented cities. But what we also see is that these men and women are living almost out in the open in gardens, in tented accommodations. And when Rui Gonzalez, the ambassador, writes about it, he says the women also came and joined the men's gatherings, and they were unveiled. All they had was a little gauze, a little bit like this, in front of their face. And you could clearly see their face, you could see their clothes. The queen came and sat amongst us, and she had wine. In fact, she had a lot of wine, and she enjoyed the company of men and women equally. So this is the sort of culture that they had, in which women were very much participants in the everyday life of the kings. And this is the sort of culture that Babur brought with him when he founded his empire in Hindustan.
Ira. Before we come to the subject of your second book, I want you to talk a little bit about Akbar, because in the popular perception, he is Akbar the Great. He is one of the great Mughals. Do you think that reputation was deserved? And if not, why so?
So I don't like the phrase Akbar the Great, and that's in the first instance because it's repetitive. Akbar means great or greater, so it sounds very, very odd. But also, I mean, Akbar the Great, if you're using the great Mughals just to sort of distinguish, Akbar through Aurangzeb or Babur through Aurangzeb as opposed to the later Mughals who just sort of hang on with very little to no power, it's fine. But if you're using great in order to issue a value judgment, right, that the Mughals were good or valuable or worthy of praise in some sense, that is an agenda I have absolutely no interest in. Right? I don't care whether the Mughals were good or virtuous. I don't find that an interesting historical question. In fact, I don't find it historical at all. So, what to say about Akbar? He's the maker of the Mughal Empire, right? If the Mughal Empire had ended with Humayun, we would talk about the Mughal interregnum, not the Mughal Empire, right? Akbar is the one who made the Mughals go from a sort of small branch of the Timurid dynasty into a full-fledged Indian empire. And he did that in a couple of different ways. There's the land conquest part, right? And sometimes people forget this aspect of Akbar, that he was vicious on the battlefield, right? The siege of Chichor is a great example, where a lot of blood was shed in order to gain that fort and surrounding areas. Akbar used diplomacy where he could. He was pretty good at convincing Rajputs to sort of, go with him, as it were. And by the end of his reign, he controlled the majority of North India, although he did not get the Deccan, right? It was his great-grandson, Aurangzeb, who managed to get that prize, longed for since Akbar's days. Akbar also built an empire in other ways, and that's what I've tended to focus on in my own work. My first book, Culture of Encounters, specifically talks about how Akbar led and sort of spearheaded this Mughal interest in traditional Indian learning, contained primarily in Sanskrit, as a way of figuring out what it meant to be a ruler of India, or as he would have put it, a ruler of Hindustan. Right? And I make that distinction, I think it's perhaps especially important in Chennai, because Akbar wasn't asking what it meant to rule over Chennai, right? He was nowhere near here. And in fact, Hindustan stopped somewhere in the Deccan, right? Possibly with the border between what we would now call North India and the Deccan, right? But in any case, so Akbar sort of spearheads this interest in Sanskrit knowledge. He has Sanskrit intellectuals at court. He has Sanskrit texts translated from Sanskrit into Persian. And there are also texts written in Sanskrit specifically for Akbar and for other members of the Mughal court. And I think that Akbar's major goal there was to sort of answer a question that his own sort of blood lineage traditions couldn't answer. Namely, what did it mean to be a ruler over India and within India? Akbar could answer, looking at his own sort of Perso-Islamic and Turkic traditions, what it meant to be a Timurid, right? But he couldn't answer what it meant to rule over Hindustan. And Sanskrit knowledge systems provided him with one way of thinking about that.
Ira, you have written about life in the Mughal harem, which was inaccessible to most, and therefore shrouded in misconceptions and half-truths, which trickled into the popular narrative. What was life actually like in the Mughal court for women, and how did these misconceptions reach us?
Right. So this is actually something which I've talked about through the length of my book, because there wasn't one way to be in the Mughal Zanana or the Mughal harem, because it changed over 200 years. If you could have slide number 8, I'll just make a few points. What it was, especially in the with the harem of the early Mughals, we're talking about of Babur and Humayun especially, it was a place of homosocial interaction. It was a place full of, this is the birth of, when Akbar is reunited with his mother in 1545. So I just wanted to illustrate to you what a lively place it was and how women were involved in the running of the zenana or the harem at every level, because it was a place in the early Mughals, these women were very peripatetic. They moved everywhere with the Badshahs because their life was with the kings. They were not left in a cloistered space, in a safe space. Their lives were vulnerable on the road, and they moved along with the entire court. So there's that first misunderstanding that Mughal women were cloistered in a certain sequestered space. That didn't happen at all. In fact, right through the great Mughals, they kept traveling a great deal. The second thing is that the women, since this space was only for women, they controlled all the jobs. So they did a lot of the running of the household of the Mughal harem. So here they are entertaining the children, there were milk mothers, there were administrators, there were dancers, there were massage ladies, there were cooks, there were women at all levels doing different functions, specific functions for which they were paid a job. But what happened when the European travelers came into India and started to experience this Mughal fastness, they began writing about it. But the problem with the Europeans was they had no direct access. So they were separated not only physically from the Mughal harem because they could not enter that space, but they were separated by language because they didn't speak Persian, and by culture because they didn't understand the traditions. So the only way in which they could explain the enormous power and influence by that time, you're talking about Shah Jahan, for example, Jahanara Begum, she was an extremely influential, powerful, wealthy woman. So the only way they found that they could explain this kind of power at a time when back home the women didn't have the right to own property, for example. European women had to give the property to their husbands when they got married. But here were these independent single women who owned their own property and could dispose of it the way they wanted. The only way they could explain that away is through all kinds of ludicrous, gossipy details, which was basically things like incest, for example. Jahanara Begum was accused of having incest with her father and her brother, Dara Shikoh. She was accused of all sorts of terrible things. So she was accused of lesbianism when she was in the, in the baths, in the Mughal baths. She was accused of using vegetables in a debauched manner, vegetables like cucumber and gourd. She was accused of having very many lovers at one go. So, one wonders when she was so busy being, debauched with in so many different ways, how she managed to do all that she finally managed to do. But what it was bazaar gossip, a fervid imagination, a misunderstanding by the Europeans, not being able to understand the culture. And so they created a world which looked less like this and more like, if you can have slide number 10, please. There was this persistent image that actually the Mughal harem was an oriental fantasy like so, and that the women mostly spent their time lazing about, trying to look as beautiful as possible, very frustrated, and trying to attract the attention of one single man. Whereas the truth was that all those women in the harem, most of them were not sexually available to the Pasha at all. They were his grandmothers, his sisters, his widowed sisters, his unmarried female relatives. They were the young boys until they grew up to a certain age. They were cousins, they were distant relatives. They were the employees, the dancers, the masseuse, all these kind of women who were not at all available to the Pasha at all in a sexual manner. But the Europeans just heard this number, 2,000 women, and that was so exciting for them, or even Abu al-Fazl, in a different way. He wanted to create a sense of grandeur around Akbar. He wanted people to know, look, Akbar can look after 5,000 women, But unfortunately, that was misinterpreted completely, and so this is the sort of idea that we have. And so that's the way that the Mughal harem, even to our day, there's this malaise about the Mughal harem. Oh dear, they were something like this indolent women who didn't do very much with their lives.
Stepping out of the zenana for just a bit, I want you, Professor Truschke, to talk about cultural diversity at the Mughal court. Why was it so important for the Mughals to cultivate Sanskrit scholars?
So I think that as I said before, I think the Mughals really turned to Sanskrit as a way of thinking about what it meant to be Indian kings and to sort of access traditions of Indian kingship. And if you think about, if you want to ask that question, what does it mean to rule over India? What does it mean to rule over Hindustan? I think that Sanskrit is the place where you go to find those answers. And the Mughals indeed found an entire range of answers in things like Akbar being compared to Rama, for example, from the Ramayana, right? That's a comparison that comes up in both Sanskrit and Persian sources from Akbar's period. So, pretty clearly had to come from the Sanskrit intellectuals, but then sort of went back into Persian traditions, right? Or thinking about the name of Akbar being inserted into the Razamnama, the Persian translation of Mahabharata, right? Again, something that can only happen if you have a very deep textual-based engagement with the Sanskrit tradition. I will say there are sort of curious things about this set of engagements that we remain a bit uncertain what to do about historically. So, one example of that is there are Sanskrit texts that are written for Emperor Akbar and addressed to him. There are even Sanskrit texts that invoke his name in the vocative, right? So you'll have a Sanskrit verse that is directly addressing Akbar. Akbar did not know Sanskrit, right? Sanskrit, for anyone who's tried to study it, this is not a language you just sort of, pick up on the fly, right? So we have no evidence that Akbar actually understood Sanskrit. This introduces a question. What does it mean to write a text for a king in a language that he does not understand, right? Perhaps the act of writing it was more important. Perhaps this mandated having an interpreter present that would be good for the Sanskrit-knowing individuals present at the Mughal court, both Brahmins and Jains, who could position themselves as valuable intermediaries. A second sort of slight mystery that's hard to know what to make of is the Brahmanical silence, as I've called it in my work, about what they're doing at the Mughal courts. So we have this one Sanskrit text that comes from Shah Jahan's period, the Kavindra Chandrodaya, right? And this is a set of Sanskrit praise verses to Kavindracharya Saraswati, one of the foremost Sanskrit intellectuals of the 17th century. And the verses praise Kavindra for his success in getting Shah Jahan to rescind certain pilgrimage taxes on Hindu pilgrimage sites in the 1640s or 50s. That is the exception that proves the rule. And the rule is that generally Brahmin intellectuals did not write about what they were doing at the Mughal court. Perhaps the most prominent example of that is as follows. If you were to only look at Sanskrit texts, you would conclude that there were never translations from Sanskrit into Persian. It is not mentioned in the Sanskrit tradition. As a historian, it is very hard to know what to make of a silence, and this is something that Ira, no doubt, you confront in your work as well with women, right? What do you do with a silence? And what you want to guard against, at least what I want to guard against, is reading modern anxieties into that silence, right? Because that's the obvious, easy thing to do in the 21st century, is to say, oh, well, they were Brahmins, they were Hindus, they're at a Muslim court. Bam, we've got a communal issue here, right? And that would be an error, because Hindu-Muslim conflict, this is a modern issue. It's as modern terminology even, right? Almost no one was calling themselves Hindu at this point in time. But then where do you go from there? It's far easier to sort of debunk a theory than to come up with something to replace it. And this is an area where the historian's hands to some degree are tied, right? When you have a lack of evidence as a historian, you look to wherever you can, you read against the grain, you try to find underutilized sources, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the evidence, you do just have to say, well, I'm not entirely certain.
So multiple Mughal emperors patronized Sanskrit scholars. Did any of them learn Sanskrit themselves?
No. Absolutely not. And you do hear these crazy things. Sometimes people will just say, oh, well, Akbar knew Sanskrit, right? He was such an eclectic guy. I think that's completely untrue. There is no evidence whatsoever for that. There's no evidence that any of the Mughal emperors ever learned Sanskrit. Even somebody like Abu Fazl, right? Akbar's chief historian, really Akbar's chief propaganda guy, right? Really an ideologue. Even Abu Fazl, I'm not convinced that he actually knew Sanskrit. He clearly knew something about Sanskrit because he writes about it in the Ayin-e-Akbari, right? He writes about, the sort of letters and sounds and retroflex and aspiration and all of these things that are not present in Persian. But could he actually sit down and read Ramayana? I sincerely doubt that.
You say in your book that Aurangzeb is a live wire of history that sparks fires in the present day. We saw some of that fire yesterday. The present day caricature of Aurangzeb as a bigoted, evil conqueror is something that began in the colonial period, which you explain in your book. Why do you think the British chose Aurangzeb in particular to vilify?
Right, so why vilify Aurangzeb, right? Why not vilify Akbar? And today we're increasingly seeing this sort of attitude of why choose? Just vilify all of them, right? All Indo-Muslim kings ever. But why Aurangzeb? So I think that there are certain things about Aurangzeb's life and the way that he conducted himself as emperor that lend themselves more towards an Islamophobic interpretation of history. And this is not a value judgment on Aurangzeb. This has everything to do with our sort of our preconceptions and ideas today, right? But to give a couple of examples, based on the evidence that I have, it does appear to be true that Aurangzeb was a slightly more conservative Muslim than prior Mughal emperors, right? And I say based on the evidence because it is my opinion as a historian that we cannot get inside someone's head, right? That's probably true even when they're alive, and it's certainly true of a dead guy, right? I have no idea what Aurangzeb Alamgir internally believed. But I can tell you that based on his actions as emperor, he did project to be following Islam. At certain points in his life, for example, he actually appears to have prayed multiple times a day, right? Something that Akbar fairly visibly gave up and even replaced with sort of reverence to the sun in a sort of pseudo-Brahmanical tradition at one point. Aurangzeb became a Hafez, right? He memorized Quran. He didn't do that as a prince, curiously. He did that as an emperor, right? He took time out from his busy schedule, as it were, to do that. When you take bits and pieces like that, plus the fact that Aurangzeb was ruthless about being an expansionist emperor, right? He led the largest set of Mughal expansions since Akbar. When you combine all of that with a sort of general prejudice against Islam, I think he's the obvious guy to sort of pick out as the most hated king of India's past.
A person that your books sort of have in common is Jahanara, who was the eldest and clearly the favorite daughter of Shah Jahan, who wielded a lot of influence at the court. So, Ira, I want you to talk a little bit about her personality and the role that she played in the battle of succession between her brothers.
Yes, so, Jahanara Begum, one of the reasons I got into the women of the Mughal Empire in the first place, an extraordinary woman. So her mother, Mumtaz Mahal, dies when she is only 17 years old. And the extraordinary thing is that at this time, Shah Jahan, instead of turning to one of his other wives, because he did have other wives, we forget about that, he turns to Jahanara Begum and makes her Padshah Begum. Now, the Padshah Begum was a title given to the most respected woman of the Mughal court, of the Mughal Zanana, and she was the woman who had ultimate say in all sorts of decisions. So if there was ever any matter that was pending, or they were waiting for a decision, or they wanted to know who was the most capable prince next, and they wanted the advice of the Zanana, they went to the Padshah Begum, and she always had final say on these things.
And it wasn't necessarily, sorry to interrupt you, the emperor's wife.
No, not at all. It was, in fact, almost never, strangely enough, the emperor's wife. One of the first women was Khanzada Begum, Babur's eldest sister, as we saw in the first slide, the one who was handed over to Shaibani Khan Uzbek. She was returned 10 years later to Babur's court, and in recognition of her sacrifice and the great role she played in keeping those memories alive, she was made Padshah Begum of Humayun's court. So it was a title given to often an older mother, an older lady, maybe an aunt or a mother. Later on, it was daughters. It was very rarely a wife, strangely enough. So Jahanara Begum became Padshah Begum at 17, which means she had this huge responsibility, because by the time of Shah Jahan, naturally, it was a huge court and it was a huge zanana to manage. So she had all these administrative affairs, and one of the first few things that she had to do was arrange for the marriage of her brothers, Dara Shikoh, Aurangzeb, Murad Baksh. All these princes were married under her auspices, because by then the mother, Mumtaz Mahal, was dead, but it was time for the princes to get married. And these were, you can imagine Indian weddings, so multiply that by 1,000 times. These were enormous celebrations meant to show to everybody the power and the wealth of the empire. So these were huge things to manage. So for 10 years, she did this. She married off all her brothers. She looked after the Zenana. She did all this incredible work. And then she writes in her, because she wrote 2 books, and she writes that after 10 years, I became very dissatisfied with my life. I was looking for spiritual meaning. And she undertakes a Sufi journey along with her brother, Dara Shikoh, who, as many of you will know, was a great Sufi connoisseur. So he introduces her to Sufism, and for a few years, Jahanara Begum immerses herself in Sufi thought, in Sufi mysticism, and she writes 2 books, which are extraordinary documents of a 17th century Muslim woman. One of them is a biography of saints, and the other one is her own mystical journey, which is really a wonderful book and gives us insight into this princess. She writes very openly about her great, love for her Sufi master. It is almost an erotic longing. People often ask me, can you mention some love story that you've unearthed in your research? And I said the strongest feelings of love I have ever found were Jahanara's for her brother Dara Shikoh, and her erotic longing for her Sufi master. So quite an interesting thing for a 17th century Muslim woman to write about. So she was an extraordinary woman. She wrote these 2 theses. And then what happened, if we can see slide number 11, please. In 1638, Shah Jahan decided that Agra was passé. He needed a brand new capital to show that he was the mightiest emperor on earth. And this is my hand-drawn diagram, so forgive me. So what he does is he comes to Delhi and he creates Shah Jahanabad, a brand new capital city. And what we forget, or what I didn't know in the beginning, was that all that Shah Jahan himself built was the Red Fort, the Qila'e-Muazzam, and the walls of the city. Later on, he builds the Jama Masjid. But the rest of the city, the Havelis, the mosques, the bazaar, he hands over to his daughters, to his wives, and to his noblemen to build as they see fit, according to his or her ambition, wealth, desires. And what is amazing and extraordinary is that that entire part in green is what Jahanara Begum built. So she built an enormous caravanserai. Now, these were the luxury hotels of their day. Foreign travelers could pass by and be kept in style for weeks and months at a time. And she had her name written on the top of the caravanserai. It was a huge edifice. Behind that were the Sahibabad gardens, or gardens for the women of the Mughal court. And then she built Chandni Chowk, the bazaar, the main bazaar of Shah Jahanabad, and she built the hammams opposite. So even if you look at it geographically, she sort of had her stamp over this middle section of Shah Jahanabad. And this to me is a very extraordinary statement of her ambition and wealth. And we forget what wealthy women these women were, because not only were the men part of the most wealthy empire at the time, the women were too, correspondingly. So she built all these wonderful structures, which were sadly later on destroyed in 1857. So we have almost nothing left of Jahanara's buildings here. But this is what she did. And she was and as Padshah Begum, she was very respected by her siblings. So both Dara Shikoh and even Aurangzeb were very close to her. Dara Shikoh especially, we all know how very close Dara Shikoh and Jahanara were, and they corresponded extensively. And whenever Dara Shikoh very rarely was sent away on campaigns, because he was mostly kept at court, when he was sent away on campaigns, she wrote letters to him saying, you know, the anguish is terrible at your absence. But even Aurangzeb keeps writing to her throughout his life until he becomes emperor, asking for her advice and asking her to intercede on his behalf with Shah Jahan. So it shows the trust he has, because he knows that Dara Shikoh is her favorite brother, but he still appeals to her judgment and to a sense of justice and fair play, and tells her to speak to Shah Jahan on her behalf. Later on, extraordinarily again, of course, when Aurangzeb becomes emperor and Shah Jahan is deposed, Jahanara lives with Shah Jahan for 7 years in Agra in imprisonment. But when Shah Jahan dies, Aurangzeb brings her back to Delhi and makes her Padshah Begum, rather than his own sister Roshnara Begum, who was his ally. She was his staunch ally all his life. Yet, when Jahanara Begum was available, when her father passed away, he makes her Padshah Begum and gives her her own Haveli outside the walls of the fort. So he gives her her independence, her wealth, her respect. And remember that this was somebody who was supposed to be his enemy, because she was on Dara Shikoh's side. But it shows the respect that even Aurangzeb had for her, and that Jahanara was able to command for the rest of her life.
Speaking of Aurangzeb, your second book is a biography of the most hated man in Indian history, as you yourself put it, and easily the most reviled Mughal emperor. What was it like to separate the man from the myth, and how deep did you have to dig to get to the complex ruler that Aurangzeb was?
So that's a great question. So, I mean, I suppose in part, it was a super exciting process for me, right? I mean, keep in mind that historians tend to be pretty odd people, right? So we get like really excited about the details of the past. So to just, to really get into some of the primary sources and the farmans and the histories, and, to read all this stuff and to check up on prior scholar citations. I mean, I just love I love this stuff. And that's perhaps somewhat inexplicable to ordinary people. But in any case, but I think part of what you're asking is about the historian's process, right, and how one works. And, for a historian, I maintain that sort of dispassionate history and objectivity, that these are lofty goals that one can never achieve, right? And, objectivity is a dirty word for many historians. We haven't believed in it arguably ever, but certainly not for many decades now. But I personally maintain that it still remains this sort of good goal, right? Even though you can never reach that place, you still want to strive towards that. And what it means to strive towards that is to use historical method. And historical method is a sort of fancy term for a complex set of tools that involve how we read text, how we try to sort out fiction from reality. And something that I remind my undergraduate students of with some regularity is just because somebody wrote it down 400 years ago does not mean it's true, right? Just because it's written in a history of Aurangzeb's reign does not mean that it is accurate. So you have to look for potential biases, for exaggerations, for what subjects a particular author might be more trustworthy on, for what subjects he or she might be less trustworthy on. And throughout this entire process, you have to be aware of your own biases as well, right? Because I inhabit the same world that we all inhabit, right? Now it's 2019. When I was writing the book, it was largely 2015 and 2016. And I can't escape my present. And in a sense, that's not a bad thing, right? You know, the practice of history as we do it now is a decisively modern practice. So to a certain degree, I embrace my present location. But I also want to fight against presentism, right? And the tendency that we all have to view the past through our own particular lenses. And that is an ongoing process of constantly checking one's own inclinations, revising one's questions, seeing where one might be misled. In practical terms, one thing that I do anytime that I come up with a conclusion that I happen to like for personal reasons, I go far out of my way to try to disprove myself, and I search for evidence that could contradict that, right? Because anytime you come up with a theory and you're like, oh, hey, that's good, I like that, maybe that fits with my politics, maybe I just, like that for other reasons, you want to make sure that you are not being swayed by those considerations, right? That you are really following the evidence. And on the flip side, I have made a number of arguments in my career, and I intend to make a number probably going forward of historical arguments that I personally don't like. And this came up actually a lot in my first book, Culture of Encounters. I make a number of points there about Akbar perhaps being slightly less tolerant than his reputation. All else being equal, I would prefer not to have made those arguments, but all else is not equal, right? And my sort of loyalty is to as accurate as possible of a representation of the past, first and foremost, and above all other considerations.
I think those are incredible tools that even people like us, lay people who are not historians, should use when we're reading, any information. So one of the big myths that you bust, or one of the most common misconceptions about Aurangzeb, is that he razed hundreds, if not thousands, of temples. And you explain in your book that the actual number was about a dozen, whereas the number of temples that Aurangzeb protected was far more. I want you to talk about the broader relationship between Mughal state authority and temples, because this is something that you explain in your book, and I don't think you got enough of a chance to talk about it yesterday. The fact that these were not merely places of Hindu worship, and what were the sort of more significant temples that he destroyed? Was this a retributive action against a particular king or kingdom, or was it a more nuanced policy? And also, I would like you to sort of tie this in with something that you have repeated in both your books, which is that we should judge these people by the standards of their time and not 21st century standards. Seems obvious, but I just wanted you to talk about that.
Right, so that's a lot, so forgive me if I don't get to all of that. Okay, let me start with the end, judging the past by the standards of the present. If you want to know whether a given pre-modern Indian king was just according to modern standards, just stop at the word pre-modern, right? That is all you need to know. None of them measure up to 21st century standards of human rights and egalitarianism and democracy, and how could they? It was a completely different world. But there is so much to know and to ask about the past other than whether we like it in the present, right? Everything interesting about the past is something else beyond that question. And it's turning then to Aurangzeb's sort of twinned policies, and they are twinned policies of temple protection and destruction, and that's a crucial point to understand. It was not, sometimes he destroyed, sometimes he protected, but rather that these impulses came out of a sort of a shared set of values. So a couple of things to understand there. One is as follows. Hindu temples in Mughal India were considered to be legitimate targets of political state action. That is something that is hard to stomach today, because today we have this sense that religion is a special realm. It is not entirely set apart from the state, but sort of protected by the state, but certainly you cannot use religious sites as punishment for state actions, right? I mean, that gets the biggest rise out of people today. This was not the case in Mughal India, and the Mughals didn't invent this, right? Hindu kings invented this. You go back all the way to the 10th century CE, and you find Hindu kings attacking and looting and desecrating each other's temples as a way of proclaiming political supremacy. The Mughals show up on this scene half a millennium later, and they say, hey, this is useful, right? We can work with this, right? We also can attack Hindu temples as a way to proclaim our political supremacy. So as moderns, what we want to do is try to, if that makes your stomach churn, that's fine, accept it, and then put it aside, right? And try to understand this from a sort of historical perspective. Then when we look at numbers, right, and people get very concerned about numbers, right? How many temples did Aurangzeb destroy, right? How many is too many? We are never going to know the exact number of temples destroyed on Aurangzeb Alamgir's orders, right? Historians work with positivist evidence, right, to a great degree. And so I can tell you that there are roughly a dozen temples, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on how one's count, that Aurangzeb ordered, desecrated, or destroyed. Perhaps there were more. That is possible. It is also possible that some of our information on these ones that were destroyed was mistaken. Rather than numbers, what I can offer you is a narrative, right? A historically based narrative about why Aurangzeb targeted specific temples. And it generally had to do with pretty mundane political reasons, right? So-and-so's temple associates rebelled, right? Landlords associated with a particular temple got a little bit uppity, right? If there was one thing that Aurangzeb Alamgir did not tolerate, nor did any of his predecessors in the Mughal line, it was armed challenges to the Mughal state, right? If you took up arms or otherwise threatened Mughal state interests, it did not matter who you were, your religion, anything like that, right? The full force of the Mughal state could be brought down upon you, okay? But on the other hand, however, while temples were subject to Mughal state destruction, they were also privileged to Mughal state protection, right? And that's where we get to this sort of other half, and in fact, the sort of majority policy of Aurangzeb, which was protecting Hindu temples, right? Aurangzeb had a very paternalistic view of himself as emperor, right? His job, in his view, was not just to collect taxes and build roads, but it was to ensure the sort of moral and ethical well-being of his citizens within different religious communities, right? So he wanted to protect Muslims, certainly, but he also wanted to protect Hindus. And he gets upset, as did Akbar, at Brahmins, for example, when he thought that Brahmins were sort of misleading other kinds of Hindus. And so Aurangzeb does protect Hindu temples, right? He grants land to Hindu communities. He issues orders that local officials shouldn't interfere with Brahmin temples. All of this is not to say that Aurangzeb was some great patron of Hinduism, right? I don't think any serious historian would ever make such a ludicrous claim, but rather that we have to understand Aurangzeb's policies of temple protection and destruction in tandem with one another as tied up with a larger view of the Mughal emperor as a paternalistic figure who should protect Hindu temples, but by the same token could destroy them when necessary.
You did manage to pack in quite a bit. Before we open to audience questions, I just want to hear from you, Ira, very quickly. What do you think is the role of popular histories? And if there was one thing that you wish, that you found in your research on Mughal women that you wish people knew more about?
Yes, well, I think after the Hindu Lit Fest this time, I'm even more convinced after listening to some of the sessions. For example, Nazia Erim's very moving session yesterday when she talks about her experience of being the mother of a Muslim child. She's a Muslim woman, and the sort of preconceptions that people have in her entourage in today, 21st century India. And she writes about having an iftar party for all the strangers in her community who would like to know more about Muslim people, and they come over to her house. And she asks them to jot down on a piece of paper all their preconceptions and prejudices that they had before coming to her house. And they write all these horrible and strange things that you cannot even imagine that people have about Muslim people. So if in any way my book about the Muslim women, the Muslim harem, can help to bring to light the fact that these women were not illiterate, they were not poor, they were not degraded, they were not subjected to terrible treatment by their husbands and brothers, that they were powerful, they were educated, they were literate, they were wonderful women who created wonderful things. Then if that is something that I have done and others are doing, this past year seems to have seen a veritable flood of writing, narrative history. If we can help to dispel some of these myths in our lives around us so that we can be better citizens of a new India, then I think that's definitely something worth doing.
Thank you so much, both of you. And now let's hear from the audience.
Hello, very interesting talk. A question to both of you on primary sourcing, but especially to Audrey, because I was at a lecture yesterday too. When I was in Aurangabad last month, and there my conception of Aurangzeb completely changed. I had read the traditional history and Aurangzeb painted as a terrible person, while in Aurangabad the general population seems to hold him in high esteem and sometimes even reverential. So my question to them was, these are lay people as well as archaeological survey guides and so on. So it's covered a different level of the population. So my question to them was, how do you know this? You are telling me something which I had not read about. And they said, well, Aurangzeb lived in the Deccan for last 20 years of his life, and he's buried here. And we have people, who lived in those times, and they have passed on the stories through the generations. So my question is, have you depended on such oral histories also for your sourcing?
So the question is, have we depended on oral histories at all for our work? The short answer to that for me is no. Oral history is a very serious branch of historiographical practice these days. But even very serious oral historians, it's hard to go back before the 19th century, really, with that. That doesn't mean that oral stories about Aurangzeb are not important, but I would categorize them today as in the realm of hagiography rather than history.
The same goes for me, for where women are concerned, I didn't have the luxury of choosing too many sources. Wherever I could, I used the words of women where they were available. So, for example, the same words, when Gulbadan writes about the harem, she writes about a warm, boisterous, loving space, whereas, an Englishman like Peter Mundy will claim that Roshna Begum had 9 lovers in one night, and when her niece asks her for one man, she refuses, and so then she gets punished. So, there's such a great discrepancy between the men and the women writing about a certain thing that for me, there was no question of using any oral sources. It was as far as possible the words of women when it was available.
2 questions. Usually in all the kingdoms, whenever such a person, Jahanara, was given the post at the age of 17, how did the second wife keep quiet? She did not conspire. She is such a good woman. Second wife, you mentioned. Was she keeping quiet? She would have conspired against it. She would have objected to it. Anything about it? How she allowed Jahanara to become...
So can you repeat your first question? I'm sorry.
How did the second wife of Shah Jahan allow the person at the age of 17 to occupy such a very big post? Did she not object? Did she not conspire? It happens in all the kingdoms, even in a TV series.
Yes.
So how is it? How is it you are telling that such a good woman she was?
The TV series are responsible for a lot of myths, so I think we will just not have to go into TV series. But what I can say is that where the Mughals were concerned, the importance of the Timurid women was paramount. So the women who carried the Timurid blood, for example. So therefore, Shah Jahan's daughters would have been at a higher level in terms of ancestry, in terms of lineage, in terms of power, than his Hindustani Rajput wives, for example. So I think, I don't know behind the scenes, and I'm not a TV filmmaker or anything of the sort, so I don't know what gossip went on, but I have a feeling that that was automatically assumed that a woman of Timurid blood would become Pacha Begum.
Secondly, you said Aurangzeb did not have a knowledge of Sanskrit.
I said what about Aurangzeb, or did Audrey say something?
Aurangzeb didn't have knowledge of Sanskrit. Akbar and Aurangzeb are considered to be great scholars. Aurangzeb, though a tyrant, they said he was a great scholar. Many texts are saying he knew everything. So how is it we can accept that Aurangzeb did not know Sanskrit? It is a very tough thing to consume.
Let's get another question, please.
Why?
The first Mughal was Babur.
When he is coming in India?
When?
1526.
1527, the Battle of Panipat.
Which is the way? Which is the country he's come?
There were no countries in a pre-nation-state world. Next question.
So you said that you can't judge the Mughal emperors by modern standards of good governance. But there are standards probably that you can use, and especially if you compare with what was happening in China or what was happening in Europe. So was progress made in a broad sense, whether it is gender equality, whether it is rights of people, whether it is the wealth of the nation, or per capita GDP, if we were to put modern terminology. So was progress happening during Akbar and Aurangzeb's and broadly the Mughal rule, and how would you do a comparison of what was happening there with what was happening elsewhere?
So that is an excellent question. There was no GDP, right? There's no way to measure that. A couple of preliminary thoughts. One is that the Mughals did generally keep wealth in India, right? This is a big distinguishing factor between the Mughal Empire versus British colonialists, right? Whose entire purpose was to extract the wealth, right? The Mughals came here and stayed here and by and large kept wealth here. In terms of comparing India to China or to other contemporary places, I guess China is really the only comparison appropriate for that period. This is something that scholars are increasingly looking at. You're seeing an increasing number of China-India comparisons in pre-modernity, but this is very difficult, partly because of language barriers and just partly because of a sort of knowledge gap, right? Frankly, it is difficult enough to try to get a handle on either pre-modern India or pre-modern China, and to try to do both is almost impossible. So what you're seeing is collaboration to try to compare those two. My sort of last comment would be, you asked about sort of the rights of people. There was no concept of this, right? This was a land of intense inequality. There was no idea that, we should be lifting up the peasant classes or something like that. So I can tell you about, specific instances of hardship, right? Such as during the Deccan Wars, when Aurangzeb is fighting the Marathas and both sides engage in a scorched earth tactic where they literally burn the countryside and crops. This causes massive famine, right? But in terms of numbers, that is very hard to get a handle on, and a lot of that has to do with our incomplete records of the Mughal Empire from this point in time.
Is there any information and evidence for the environmental protection in view of the massive structures and luxurious lifestyles, the wastage disposal and other things?
Environmental costs? Yeah, no one was really talking about the environment either in the 17th century, sorry.
Thank you so much for being such an engaged audience. Both Professor Truschke and Ira Mukhoty will be signing books outside, so you can ask them more questions there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear panelists. Request all audience members to please exit from the back door. Please don't crowd the guests as they leave the stage. Thank you. There will be book signing on the ground floor. A special announcement, at 4 p.m. today, there will be a performance by Otta Sivre, an indie rock band, at the Zero Waste counter. We will now break for lunch. The next session begins at 2:30 p.m. Please be back on time. We have an interesting array of speakers lined up for you. A moment now to thank our sponsors for their support. In association with NewsX, associate sponsors VR Mall Chennai, Fresh Food Partner ID Foods, Session Sponsor United India Insurance, Bookstore Partner Higginbotham's, Water Partner Archie Water, Wi-Fi Partner ACT, Radio Partner Fever FM, and brought to you by Theme. Thank you so much.